Hey y'all, how's it going? Out on my back porch where the sun is shining. Even so, I felt like maybe you would give you some comfort if I wore my my blue vest and my checkered shirt that I always wore to class. Probably the last time I'll be wearing this for a few months, hopefully. But anyway, I wanted to take you through this Kierkegaard piece, The Rotation of Crops. I believe you all have read now, or hopefully you should have. And I don't have really an external commentary so much as I want to read through some of the best parts that I enjoy from this, make a little bit of commentary, and just challenge you or invite you to respond to this piece a little bit more. So, as I told you, I find this a hilarious piece at points, and it really is sort of a nerdy thing to enjoy, especially at the beginning. Just to remind you, he's writing in the 19th century in the country of Denmark, which is just north of Germany, near Norway. And I've been lucky enough to visit there a few times. It's a beautiful country. And Kierkegaard is known as a pretty gloomy writer in some ways. You saw that in the video, but here I don't think there's a whole lot of gloom. I think he's really enjoying himself. So the rotation of crops. If you read this, you know that it's not a literal phrase. It refers to, it's a metaphor for our mental activity, or you might say our attention. Right? What are we to do with our attention? He says, rotate the crops. But before he gets to that metaphor, his opening paragraph, I think, is pretty hilarious. I'm not going to try to make you laugh, but he is mocking philosophers and physicists or scientists in this first paragraph. And you know, some of the best ways of mocking someone is to parody them, is to act like them and then show how foolish they are. So he says, people with experience, the important people, maintain that proceeding from a basic principle is supposed to be very reasonable. I yield to them and proceed from a basic principle that all people are boring. Or is there anyone who'd be boring enough to try to contradict me in this regard? Right? All your stupid arguments, like, this is boring. People are boring. I'm bored. You're boring. But I'll play your game. Let's be philosophers. This basic principle has, to the highest degree, the repelling force, always required in the negative, which is actually the principle of motion. It's not merely repelling, but infinitely repulsive. And whoever has the basic principle behind him must necessarily have infinite momentum for making discoveries. Okay, so here he is parroting physics, right? Isaac Newton and all the scientists who say, we know how the world works, we know how it is. You have force and momentum and repulsion and attraction, and right, F equals ma and all these equations, and he is taking this scientific intellectual thing and applying it to boredom. Right? He's going to say, okay, you want to be scientific? Let's talk scientifically. The formula is something like human plus boredom equals motion. Whenever a human being gets off their butt to do something, I can tell you what it is. It's boredom. Boredom doesn't cause the motion. The hatred of boredom, the repulsion of boredom is so strong. We hate it so much that we have to get away from it, and it pushes us through space, right? We act. Okay, so in a couple sentences, he's made fun of philosophers who want first principles and logic, and he's made fun of scientists. It is very curious that boredom, which itself has such a calm and sedate nature, that it can have such a capacity to initiate motion. The effect that boredom brings about is absolutely magical, but this effect is not one of attraction, but of repulsion. All right, so he's painting a picture here. Human beings move, we act, for one reason and one reason alone. This first principle, everyone's bored. So stop and ask yourself, how often do you get bored? How often do you just feel, this is boring, I don't like this, I'm bored, it's boring, I wish I could, right? You want to be somewhere else, you want to be doing something else. Ask yourself this, how many times do you reach for the phone out of boredom? You're sitting over here, listening to a lecture, doing your homework, and bored, I gotta see what's on my phone. How corrupting boredom is, he says. Everyone recognizes this also with regard to children. And then he says, people recognize this because when they hire someone to watch the kids, a babysitter, we would say, and in these areas they would have, full-time babysitters, we might call them a nanny. He says, in addition to being a good cook and being able to take care of the kids and all of that, having, CPR training and all of that, the one thing, he says, we know we can never afford to forget about in a nanny is whether or not they can entertain the children. Because all that other stuff won't matter if the kids are bored. Because if the kids are bored, all hell is going to break loose. Interesting. Seems like he's onto something there. Fairly accurate. Here indeed, and it'd be great if you read this along with me. I think that would really help. So I'm on the first page, third paragraph. Here indeed the principle is clearly acknowledged, principle of boredom. But things go on so curiously in the world. Habit and boredom have gained the upper hand to such a degree that justice is done to aesthetics only in the conduct of the nursemaid, the nanny. It would be quite impossible to prevail if one wanted to also demand a divorce because one's wife was boring. You can fire a nanny for being boring, not being able to entertain the children, right? But we just stop there, he says. We don't recognize this basic principle in marriage where, my husband's bored, I'm out of here. Or he said we don't demand that a king be dethroned because he's boring. Or that a priest be exiled because he's boring to listen to. Or that a cabinet minister be dismissed or a journalist be executed because he's frightfully boring. What's wrong with us? What's wrong with us? But if he's right, that boredom is at the root of things, it's really what moves us in the negative, right? That we're repulsed by it. Maybe we should consider that. And then he tells a hilarious history, right, of creation. He says, since boredom advances and boredom is the root of all evil, no wonder that the world goes backwards, that the world goes backwards and that evil spreads. This can be traced back to the beginning of the world. The gods were bored, they created human beings. Adam was bored because he was alone, therefore Eve was created. Since that moment, boredom entered the world and grew in quantity, in exact proportion to the growth of the population. Another person shows up, more boredom in the world. Another person shows up, more boredom in the world. Adam was bored alone, then Adam and Eve were bored together. After that, the population of the world increased, and the nations were bored all together. To amuse themselves, he's still sticking to the Bible. There's a story in the Bible of the people building a huge tower, one of the biggest towers in the city of Babel. So he's talking about that. People were bored, and they built this tower, and he says the tower was just as boring as it was high. And then they were dispersed around the world. And what consequences boredom had? Humankind stood tall and fell far, first through Eve, then from the Tower of Babel. On the other hand, what was it that delayed the fall of the Roman Empire? He says, bread and games, gladiator games, right? All of this entertainment. So what are we doing in our day? The Romans figured it out, right? If you're going to keep people happy, if you're going to keep chaos from engulfing us because people are bored, keep people entertained. What about us? And then he just goes on. On the contrary, we're We're the most boring people on earth. We insist on boredom. And he talks about conferences and, what could be more boring than that? Boring, boring, boring. Second page, 187. Idleness, we are accustomed to say, is the root of all evil. But he says, idleness as such, just being idle, not having anything to do, is by no means the root of evil. On the contrary, it's truly the divine life if one is not bored. Right? So what is heaven supposed to be? Heaven is, right? A place where you don't have to work. You can be completely idle. That's supposed to be the best place. So what's the difference between being idle on earth and idle in heaven? Or idleness itself is not the problem. To be sure, he says, idleness may be the occasion of losing one's property, but the noble nature does not fear such things, but does fear being bored. Boredom is the root of evil. It is that which must be held off. Idleness is not the evil. Indeed, it may be said that everyone who lacks a sense for idleness shows that he has not raised himself to the human level. A couple sentences later. There are people, I love this is still true of us today. There are people who have an extraordinary talent for transforming everything. Wherever they are, whatever's going on, whatever the situation, they have this amazing talent for transforming it into a business operation, whose whole life is a business operation. Sitting at dinner, you answer the phone, right? I'm a professor. I can turn my whole life into emails and discussion boards and, right? Well, I got to do that. No, it's important. Got to do it. Transform every situation into a business. Or, right, if you're literally a business person, you transform your situations into some kind of profit opportunity, right? Always expanding, always growing. Some things never change. But notice what he includes in this. Whose whole life is a business operation. Who fall in love and are married. Hear a joke. Admire a work of art with the same business-like zeal with which they work at the office. The Latin proverb, idleness is the devil's pillow, is quite correct, but the devil does not find time to lay his head on this pillow if one is not bored. But since people believe that it's man's destiny to work, the opposite is correct. I assume that it is man's destiny to amuse himself. Okay, so I think this is one of the moments where you begin to see a hint of where he's going with this. Because he's just described someone who has a talent, specific talent, and that talent is for taking the world as it is, a movie, a piece of art, a friendship, an affair, whatever it is. You take the circumstance and you treat it like a business deal. You treat it like something where you're out to do it the most efficient way, the most serious way, and get the most profit or benefit out of it. He says that's a talent. He's going to suggest, a lot like Camus, that life depends on talent. And the talent has less to do with your circumstances and more to do with your mind, your mentality, your mental skills. So 187, middle of the page. Now, if boredom is the root of all evil, then what is more natural than to seek to conquer it? But here, as everywhere, it's primarily a matter of calm deliberation, lest demonically possessed by boredom in an attempt to escape it, one works one's way into boredom. All who are bored cry out for change. In this, I totally agree with them, except it's a question of acting according to principle. My deviation from popular opinion is expressed by the phrase rotation of crops. And then he's going to discuss two meanings of that phrase. The first he will call the extensive meaning, which we can just call the external. And there he describes the rotation of crops, the rotation of your attention, right? So he says it's man's destiny to amuse himself. How do you do that? Well, go to a play, watch some football, all the things we can't do now, right? So get yourself into different circumstances so that you're not bored and you're amused. Go seek out amusing things, in other words. One is weary of living in the country and moves to the city. One is weary of one's native land and goes abroad. One's weary of Europe and goes to America. One indulges in the fanatical hope of an endless journey from star to star. So he says that's what most people think. Or there's another direction, but still extensive, external. One is weary of eating on porcelain and eats on silver. Wearying of that, you eat on gold. One burns down half of Rome in order to visualize the Trojan War. This method cancels itself and is spurious. What, after all, did Nero achieve? The Emperor Antoninus was wiser, he said. You can begin a new life, only see things afresh as you used to see them. In this consists the new life. The method I propose, bottom of 187, does not consist in changing the soil, but in changing the method of cultivation and the kinds of crops. Here at once is the principle, listen to this, the principle of limitation, the soul-saving principle in the world, the principle of limitation. The more a person limits himself, the more resourceful he becomes. The more you limit yourself, the stronger you become. Example. The more a solitary prisoner for life, so someone who's in prison for life, is extremely resourceful. Well, the person is extremely limited, right? Extremely resourceful. To him, a spider can be a source of great amusement. When was the last time you sat down and spent 3 hours watching a spider spin a web? I haven't done it. I'm guessing there are lots of prisoners around the world that are doing that right now, or something very similar to it. But let's stick with spiders. Spiders are everywhere. They weave webs. I'll bet you there are prisoners right now watching and being fascinated and entertaining themselves watching a spider. Think of our school days. We were at an age where there was no aesthetic consideration in choosing our teachers. Therefore, they were often very boring. But how resourceful we were with them. What fun we had catching a fly, keeping it prisoner, and watching it run around. What delight in cutting a hole in the desk, confining a fly in it, and peeking at it through a piece of paper. How entertaining it can be to listen to the monotonous dripping from the roof. What a meticulous observer one becomes, detecting every little sound or movement. Here is the extreme. He said these are extreme cases. The extreme boundary of that principle that seeks relief not through extensivity, not through things outside of you, but through intensivity, things within you. What's the difference between the prisoner watching the spider web and me watching something on Netflix? We're both entertaining ourselves, right? Or what if Netflix disappeared? What if the NFL disappeared, the NBA disappeared, the NHL disappeared? Which they have. Do I have the resources to entertain myself? Prisoners do. Do I? Or what's the difference between them and me? I often rely on external, you might say, stimulation to entertain me, right? Prisoner doesn't have that. They turn to internal, they intensify their own capacity to notice every drip of water on the roof, right? Every ray of sunlight becomes interesting to them. Okay, now he turns to another theme. I'm going to have to go a little faster because I'm taking too long. On 188, the more resourceful one can be in changing the method of cultivation, the better. But every particular change still falls under the universal rule of the relation between recollecting and forgetting. It is in these two currents that all life moves. So now he's introducing, again, something very familiar to us. Remembering things, and forgetting things. You want to say hi to my wife? I'm recording a video for my class.
Okay.
So remembering things and forgetting things. These are two relationships that we have to the past, right? He says in these two relationships, everything is determined. How can that be? To live artistically, as long as a person hopes, I'm going to skip that. Let's go to the next paragraph. To forget. This is the desire of all people. And when they encounter something unpleasant, they always say, if only I could forget that. But to forget is an art. It's a skill that must be practiced in advance. To be able to forget always depends upon how one experiences actuality. The person who runs aground, who has difficulty with the speed of hope, will recollect in such a way that he will be unable to forget. No part of life ought to have so much meaning for you that you cannot forget it at any moment if you want to. On the other hand, every single part of life ought to have so much meaning for a person that he can remember it at any moment. Okay, so he's sort of talking about the fact that some of our experiences are pleasant, some are unpleasant, and they fall all in these different ranges, right? So something happens to you, it's in the past. If it was unpleasant, it's better for you not to remember it. If it was pleasant, it's better for you to be able to recall it. But he says you have to act ahead of that. You should live your life now as you're creating future memories in such a way that things have enough interest for you and are pleasant enough, but not so much that you won't want to forget them later when they become boring to you. Things should have enough meaning for you now. You should enjoy things now. You should have meaning, but not so much meaning that you can't let go of them. But they shouldn't be completely meaningless either, because then you won't have anything good to remember. He calls this living artistically. Like an artist, you're creating your life in the moment. You're also creating it through your memories. And you have to be an artist. You have to be skillful at knowing what to include and what to leave out, how to produce beautiful future memories now, but ones that are not so beautiful that in the future you'll be tempted not to forget them, because you have to be able to forget everything, because it might become boring. A couple lines down. If one enjoys indiscriminately to the very end, if you enjoy everything equally, fully, if one continually takes the utmost that enjoyment can give, you'll be unable to recollect or forget, because they'll all be the same. So again, this is right. Memory relies on distinguishing which memories are worth recollecting and which are not, which are worth forgetting. And so you have to live your life in such a way that you're not always enjoying everything to the fullest, and you're not always, of course, you're not bored. You have to create a variety so that when you rotate the crops, there's enough to choose from. All right, the bottom of the page. When an individual has perfected himself in the art of forgetting and the art of recollecting, he is able to play shuttlecock with all existence. Shuttlecock is badminton. Right? To play with existence. Isn't that what artists do? You play with existence. To play with existence, to play with your own existence, to play with the present, and to play with the past. Didn't really hear talk about the future so much, but to play with it, right? Make it beautiful, make it enjoyable, but keep it light, playful. It's not serious. It's not heavy, because that weighs you down. That becomes boring, right? And then he gets into some implications of this. The art of recollecting and forgetting will also prevent a person from foundering in any particular relationship in life. foundering in relationships. So he sees relationships as a negative thing. Guard then against friendship. One drinks a toast, one opens an artery, one mingles one's blood with the friends. Just when this moment arrives, it's difficult to determine, but it proclaims itself in a mysterious way. One feels it and can no longer say no to the other. Once this feeling is present, it can never turn out that one has made a mistake. What are the sure signs of friendship? Antiquity answers. Agreement in likes and dislikes. This and only this is what counts as friendship. And it's also extremely boring. Right? So he's painting a picture of even something like friendship as a trap, because it can become serious, right? It can become an obligation. It become a duty, a habit. A responsibility, and that's boring. It's boring. You should conduct your relationships, your friendships, in such a way that you're able to enjoy one another without ever developing enough feelings. This is what he's talking about here. That feeling that you can't say no to that person, that you can't just leave and do something else that's more interesting. But it's a trap. Intimacy is a trap. But just because one stays clear of friendship, one will not for that reason live without contact with people. On the contrary, these relationships can take a deeper turn now and then, provided that one always, even though keeping the same pace for a time, has enough reserve speed to run away from them. Keep yourself entertained. Next paragraph. Never become involved in marriage. Married people pledge love for each other throughout eternity. Well, now that's easy enough, but doesn't mean very much. For if one is finished with time, one is probably finished with eternity, if you die, right? If instead of saying throughout eternity, the couple would say, until Easter or next May, then what they say would make some sense. But then they'd be saying something, and also something they could maybe carry out. But what happens in marriage? First, one of them detects after a short time that something is wrong. Then the other one complains and screams, faithlessness, faithlessness. After a while, one comes to the same conclusion, and a state of neutrality is inaugurated through, I love this, a balancing of accounts by mutual faithlessness to their common satisfaction and gratification. The pretty dark, cynical view of marriage, right? Basically saying, if you understand that you are capable of entertaining yourself, of having a good life, of choosing a good life, of rotating the crops, and that this is a possibility for you, don't get married. Because a marriage will involve you in all kinds of obligations and duties that prevent you from really relieving yourself of boredom. And so he thinks what a marriage ends up most of the time is that most people end up saying, I won't hold you to things if you don't hold me to things, and as long as we both agree on that, then we're okay. Right? We'll play the game, but it doesn't really mean that much. One other thing on marriage he says here that really struck me, next paragraph. Since marriage is like that, it's not strange that the attempts are made in many ways to shore it up with moral props. If a man wants to be separated from his wife, the cry goes up, he's mean, a scoundrel. Kierkegaard says, how ridiculous. What an assault upon marriage. Either marriage has intrinsic value, and the person then is adequately punished by losing it, or it has no reality, and then it's unreasonable to vilify him because he's wiser than others. If someone becomes weary of his money and threw it out the window, no one would say he's a bad person. For either money has reality, and then he's punished by not having it, or it has no reality, and then maybe we'd say he's wise. Now, I think part of what he's saying here, the way I would look at it is something like this. Two people get hot and horny for each other and then they get married, right? That's what happens. And yet, what our society does, right, is create this whole superstructure, this whole system that says marriage is, if you even put aside the religious part of it, right, that it's a contract and it's a promise and it's binding and it's legal, and if you don't obey it, if you don't follow it, then you are, a bad person, and you can be taken to court and all these kind of things. He's just pointing out that we don't do that with something like money, right? If you say, hey, I divorce myself of my money, we don't take you to court and say that there's something wrong, because we recognize that you're punishing yourself. I mean, it's a free decision and you're punishing yourself. There's no moral problem with it. If love was its own value, if love had the value of money, for example, then when someone threw it away, why would we punish them for it? Why would we say, right, you're a bad person? We would say, I feel bad for you that you've lost something that's really valuable. Okay, I'm going to skip through. There is a funny joke on 190. He says, admittedly, there's the example. I don't know where this example came from, but it's hilarious. Admittedly, there's an example of a gypsy woman who carries her husband on her back throughout life. But for one thing, this is a great rarity. And for another, it is very tiring in the long run for the husband. Okay. Relationships are fraught, he thinks, with all kinds of boring things. Then he comes to sex, right, in the middle of 190. Oh, by the way, he wrote a whole piece, sort of a fictional diary, which I think some of you would really, really enjoy. It's called The Diary of a Seducer. And that's exactly what it is. Again, he pretends to be someone else, and he writes this diary of a guy who's trying to seduce this young woman, and all the things he goes through and all the things he does. And it's similar to this, but it's sort of a autobiographical thing. The erotic, too, ought to have infinity, but a poetic infinity that could just as well be limited to 1 hour a month. When two people fall in love with each other and sense that they are destined for each other, it's a question of having the courage to break it off. For by continuing, there's only everything to lose and nothing to gain. It seems to be a paradox, and indeed it is, for the feelings, not for the understanding. In this domain, it's primarily a matter of being able to use moods. If a person can do that, an inexhaustible variation of combinations can be achieved. To use moods. Now that would be a sign of self-mastery, wouldn't it? If you got up in the morning and you're feeling a certain way and you said, you know what, I'm going to use this mood to do something interesting. Or I'm going to change my mood because it's not helpful, and I'm going to get into a different mood so that I can do something interesting. It sort of occurs to me, again, this is what artists do, right? Musicians, and they're sitting there playing their guitar, listening for something, and they are trying to kind of create and then use a mood to do something beautiful or interesting. Can you do that? Can you do that? Can you do it with your own life? Can you do it right now? An hour from now? Would you be able to take your mood and use it? Now notice what's happening here. With friendship, with marriage, with lovers, the other person is just a part in your entertainment, right? And as soon as they get boring, or as soon as you're bored, you have to have the courage, he says, to throw them away. Same thing with work. He says don't take any official business, and nothing's important. Just play with your career. Make it as lighthearted as you can. Bottom of 190. gives you a little more advice on how to use your moods. And then his final piece of advice has to do with what he calls arbitrariness. I think this is beautiful, interesting. Arbitrariness is the whole secret, he says. It's popularly believed that there is no art to being arbitrary, and yet it takes profound study to be arbitrary in such a way that a person does not himself run wild, but has pleasure from it. One does not enjoy the immediate object, but something else that one arbitrarily introduces. So, for example, if you're watching a TV show, start halfway through, he says. His example is, one sees the middle of a play. One reads the third chapter of a book. One thereby has enjoyment quite different from what the author intended. One enjoys something totally accidental. One considers the whole of existence from this standpoint. One lets its reality run aground on this. I shall give an example. There was a man whose chatter I was obliged to listen to because of the circumstances. On every occasion, he was ready with a little philosophical lecture that was extremely boring. On the verge of despair, I suddenly discovered that the man perspired exceptionally when he spoke. This perspiration now absorbed my attention. I watched how the pearls of perspiration collected on his forehead, then united into a rivulet, slid down his nose, ended in a quivering globule that remained suspended at the end of his nose. From that moment on, everything was changed. I could have delight of encouraging to continue his philosophical instruction, just to watch the perspiration on his brow and on his nose. Arbitrary, right? Just little random thing. Random is the word we use all the time. That's random. The randomness. Randomness is the key, he says. But, of course, the world is full of randomness. It's up to us to notice it. Rotate the crops. This guy sweats a lot. Play with it. Go with it. There's a spider in the corner. Watch it. Right? The next person he talks about is he takes so much pity on this guy because he has a name that doesn't rhyme with anything. How sad. Rhyming. Arbitrary. The fact that two words sound the same, completely different meanings, but they sound the same. We have developed centuries and centuries and centuries of poetry on that arbitrary fact. All the music you listen to is based on the arbitrary rhyming of words. And it's marvelous. The world is full of arbitrary things. What are you waiting for? Let the serious go. Let the important go. Let business go. Let friendship go. Let all these things go. Or find the arbitrary in them. Use them. Let the world entertain you. But it takes skill. You have to remember, that memory, I don't want to remember that. That's not entertaining. That one, yeah, come on, bring it back. That person is boring. But look, their socks don't match. Right? Funny. Interesting. They keep using the same words. Wonder where that came from, right? The arbitrary is the key. Finally, last page, second to last paragraph. The eye with which one sees actuality must be changed continually. And now we're back to Camus in certain ways, right? Sisyphus, ultimately, the difference in his life was to change the eye, right? The way he looked at his situation. And once he looked at his situation by saying, hey, this is my rock, I choose this rock, the whole world changed. Right? Kierkegaard is pushing some of these same themes around questions now of boredom and other kinds of things. But it really seems to me to be a philosophy or a way of thinking. Again, spoken in one of Kierkegaard's voices. It's very difficult for us to know if he agrees with this or not. But in a time of the suspension of life, or in a time where most of the things that we've had to entertain us or to keep us busy or to keep us occupied are gone, this essay really, makes me think about, I guess, a couple things, along with Camus, my choices. And secondly, if I really need all of the clutter, if I need to have 4 streaming services, if I need to have 12 tabs open on my laptop, if I need to have a laptop, if I need to have all the music of the world at my fingertips, do I really need all of that to have a rich, interesting life? Kierkegaard would say, if I do, that says something about me. Because the prisoner can have a rich, interesting life sitting in a cell with nothing around. And that's an extreme case, of course, right? But he's suggesting that the quality of your life, and maybe you're not just going to look for entertainment, right? Maybe you don't agree that boredom is the only enemy. But nonetheless, I think he's challenging us to say, perhaps the quality of our lives is going to depend much, much less on what's around us than what's within us. What we cultivate, right? What we are able to notice, what we care to notice, what we choose to notice, what we remember and forget, how skillful we are at not obsessing about things, not worrying about things, right? These are things that we're holding on to. Can we rotate and turn off CNN for a few hours and go out and, do something else? Get your mind off of things, etc., etc. The rotation of crops.